Hello and welcome to the 9th Time for Action webinar on the murky issue of taxation in Canada. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I'd like to start by acknowledging that my colleagues Kathleen O'Hara, Rolly Montpellier, and I are on the traditional unceded lands of the Algonquin peoples in the Ottawa area, as well as our two excellent guests. We're going to start with a short video, just about 3 minutes from the World Economic Forum that we think will really set the tone for this and is kind of amusing, entertaining, and show some clarity about some of the issues we're talking about. So I'm going to try and put that up now. Sorry, this always takes a little bit of time to get up and going.
This is my first time at Davos, and I find it quite a bewildering experience, to be honest. I mean, 1,500 private jets have flown in here to hear Sir David Attenborough speak about, how we're wrecking the planet. And I mean, I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, I mean, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. I mean, it feels like I'm at a firefighters conference and no one's allowed to speak about water, right? there was only one panel, actually.
Well, we've had two. You're the second of our panelists.
There was only one panel.
Let's go there.
One panel hidden away in the media center that was actually about tax avoidance. I was one of the 15 participants. So something needs to change here. I mean, 10 years ago, the World Economic Forum asked the question, what must industry do to prevent a broad social backlash? The answer is very simple. Just stop talking about philanthropy and start talking about taxes. Taxes. We need to, I mean, just 2 days ago, there was a billionaire in here, what's his name, Michael Dell. And he asked the question like, name me one country where a top marginal tax rate of 70% has actually worked. And, I'm a historian. The United States, that's where it has actually worked. In the 1950s, during Republican President Eisenhower, the war veteran, the top marginal tax rate in the US was 91% for people like Michael Dell. The top estate tax for people like Michael Dell was more than 70%. I mean, this is not rocket science. I mean, we can talk for a very long time about all these stupid philanthropy schemes. We can invite Bono once more, but come on, we got to be talking about taxes. That's it, taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
We have a tax system that leaks so much that allows $170 billion of money every year to be taken to tax havens and to be denied the developing countries that need that money most. So we have to look at the business model, and we have to look at the role of governments to tax and plow back money into people's lives.
I have to say, honestly, this is a very one-sided panel. The US basically has the lowest unemployment rate ever, the lowest Black unemployment rate ever, lowest youth unemployment ever. We've actually reduced poverty around the world. No one's talking about that at all. So I'd like the panel to talk about beyond taxes, which every one of you have talked about. The only thing you've talked about in this whole panel on inequality, what can we really do to help solve inequality over time beyond taxes?
The gentleman who said we've just stopped taxes and that jobs are there and there's low and unemployment rates are low. Let me tell you something. We're talking about jobs, but the quality of those jobs. We also work with poultry workers in the richest country in the world, the United States. Poultry workers. These are women who are cutting the chickens and packing them, and we buy them in the supermarkets. Dolores, one woman we work with there, told us that she and her co-workers have to wear diapers to work because they are not allowed toilet breaks. This is in the richest country in the world. That's not a dignified job. Those are the jobs we are being told about, that globalization is bringing jobs. The quality of the jobs matter. It matters. These are not jobs of dignity. In many countries, workers no longer have a voice. They are not allowed to unionize. They are not allowed to negotiate for salaries. So we're talking about jobs, but jobs that bring dignity. We're talking about healthcare.
Okay,
The World Bank has told us that 3.4 billion people who earn $5.5 a day are on the verge, are just a medical bill away from sinking into poverty. They don't have health care.
Okay. Well, I think maybe we should just go home. I think that really covered off everything we could possibly want to know about what we need to do and how the rich feel about it. But let's continue. Sorry, it's always a little slow because it's hard to shift things here. We have two excellent guests today. The first is Katrina Miller, the program director at the Broadbent Institute, driving the Institute's policy, campaign, and communications work to expand the progressive landscape in Canada. She likes to share her knowledge through training activists in communications tactics and facilitating the campaign and strategic planning. Toby Sanger is our other guest. He's the executive director of Canadians for Tax Fairness. He was an economist for the Canadian Union of Public Employees. He previously worked as a chief economist for the Yukon and as a principal economic advisor to the Ontario Finance Minister. Kathleen will ask our guests questions for 30 to 40 minutes, and then I'll have some follow-up questions, and then Rolly will follow up with some questions from you folks. So please put your questions in the Q&A. Over to you, Kathleen.
Thanks, Ken. Welcome everyone, especially our wonderful guests. Toby, I'd like to start with a general question. Why is tax policy important to the functioning of our society?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, and thank you for having us. That's a good question, and there are a number of different reasons why tax policy is important. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said that taxes are the price that we pay for a civilized society. So that's pretty important. Taxes are the way that we pay for public education, for healthcare, for environmental protection, for social protection, for our political legislatures and our justice system. So we can't really have much of a civilized society unless we have taxes. And they're also a way for everybody to contribute to our commonwealth, to our public services, and to our common good. And secondly, taxes can and should also help with redistribution so we have a more equal society. They do so by funding public services, but they should also do so by direct redistribution. They should be progressive, but unfortunately, as a result of cuts to top income tax rates, cuts to corporate tax rates, and loopholes, we have a system so that the top 1% pays a lower overall rate of tax as a share of their income than all other income groups in society. And then thirdly, taxes can play a role in incentivizing or discouraging certain behaviors, as with sin taxes or carbon taxes. And all Canadians are taxpayers, as is anybody who buys or anything pays sales taxes. So we all contribute and benefit from having a civilized society.
Thank you, Toby. Katrina, generally, we'll go into more detail later. How unfair is our present tax system, and what harm do you think it does, the unfairness?
Well, I think the unfairness of the tax system is linked to the unfairness of how our resources and wealth are shared in our economy. We actually polled on this in 2014 and asked Canadians, how unfair do you think the wealth share is in the economy right now? And what we found was that Canadians were shocked to find out, in fact, that the 1% own near the majority of our wealth, and that the bottom 10% own virtually nothing And that's a real mark around how our resources are distributed, like Toby said, and a real mark around the unfairness of our tax system. Many of the taxes we're going to talk about today, the tax structures we're going to talk about today, from corporate tax to tax loopholes to how, or the fact that we really don't tax wealth in our society, are going to show that in fact the wealthy are getting a lot of their income and wealth put away, hoarded away in ways that are untaxed, while all of us who work regular jobs have to pay full freight on our incomes and on what we try to collect to be able to provide for our families.
It's not a pretty picture, is it? Toby, the federal government just announced yesterday that it will be presenting its 2021 budget on April 19th. And you've written that you think this is one of the most important budgets in decades. Why do you say that?
Well, it's the first federal budget since the pandemic hit. We didn't have a federal budget last year. And the pandemic has been the biggest economic shock that we've had in decades, of course. We, of course, went through the financial crisis and the Great Recession a dozen years ago, but we squandered that opportunity to address the other massive crisis and challenge that we have facing us, and that's climate change. So instead of using that opportunity where the federal government invested billions in infrastructure that could have put us on a path to lower carbon and more sustainable economy, the Harper government doubled down on fossil fuels and high carbon infrastructure like roads, oil sands, pipelines, and we've seen where that's led. So now we have our last chance to really build back better and to make the critical investments we need to make them, to have a more sustainable, low carbon and more humane economy, and to finally deal with climate change. So I feel like this is our last chance to do this. And then we also need to address the crisis of growing inequality that the pandemic has further exposed. While our wealthiest billionaires have added to their wealth, with those with the least, the lowest incomes and marginalized people who were hurt most by the pandemic and had the least protection. So we need to expand social protections and increase public services like childcare. All of these things are going to cost money, as well as paying for the pandemic and building back better. It's going to cost tens of billions probably. And so we need to increase taxes to pay for that. And those taxes should be progressive because the money is there, especially in the pockets of the wealthy and corporations. And then lastly, this budget could trigger an election. So that's important. I hope that they make it progressive enough so that the NDP, the Greens and Bloc support it and we don't have an election, but we'll see.
I'd like to go back in time a bit because we haven't always been unfairly taxed. Things were a little more, as Rutger Bregman said, things were fairer after the war. Katrina, can you tell us why that was changed?
Well, around the 1970s, we started to see a shift, particularly in the States, and then it spread through a variety of countries, towards a low tax mantra. And it really, came upon this idea that if we gave people money and put it back in their pockets, if we gave corporations money and put it back in their pockets, they would then go buy stuff, go invest in stuff that would fuel greater economic activity and then boost our economy. And by boosting our economy, then all of us would reap the benefits from that. And so starting about the 1970s, we start to see tax rates, particularly on capital, so particularly on that wealth that's gathered, start to ratchet down kind of across the world, across OECD countries, and certainly in Canada too. In Canada, we see during that period of time, the top bracket of the personal income tax rate dropped from 43% to 33%. We see the corporate tax rate drop from 36% to now it's at 15%. And you can't just blame one government on this. This is consecutive conservative governments, liberal governments. This is Mulroney. This is Chrétien. This is Harper. So we see this follow through both liberal and conservative governments, and that's true in other jurisdictions too. What we're finding out now, of course, is that we were sold a lie. so to say. That in fact, there's great research done now by the London School of Economics that looks at the last 50 years of tax cuts and says there was no economic benefit to these tax cuts. And in fact, it just increased inequality, which is linked to having a drag on our economy. In fact, may stagnate our economy. So it's done exactly the opposite. Right now, when we're facing, this moment in time where we have to recover from this massive global pandemic, we're staring down the barrel at climate crisis. We're staring down the barrel at what epidemiologists say could be further pandemics coming at us. This is the moment where we need to change tracks. We need to ensure that we have a democratically chosen recovery plan that boldly invests in the kinds of things that benefit us all. Really, really great healthcare, obviously, great education, decent jobs, a caring and clean economy. We need a plan that does that. And then we need to ensure that we have the tax base that funds it. Right now, with the hoarding of wealth that's gone on, it's clear where those taxes should come from.
Just following up from that, I heard quite a few years ago, well, when Mark Carney was still the head of the Bank of Canada, he talked about $50 billion of dead money that corporations had accumulated because of the tax cuts that Katrina is talking about. Toby, they were supposed to be invested wisely. How much, do you know how much dead money there is out there now?
Well, it's actually more than 50 billion. It was more
Yes.
like 500. It was 500 billion.
That's
And
incredible.
and it's approximately that same amount. So yeah, that's Mark Carney, who was a governor of the Bank of Canada. I think he said that about a dozen years ago or a decade ago, and then also governor of the Bank of Canada. He said that he called it dead money, and he said that corporate cash balances were in ruddy good health and complained that they should be investing that money, but they weren't because the demand was there. And Flaherty said that as well. So so the record corporate profits and that corporate tax cuts have contributed to led to this big. A lot of it went into corporate cash balances like that. Those who lived through the 80s and 90s and remembered it should remember that there were a whole lot of business bankruptcies at that time. We had very few during the Great Recession and also so far during the pandemic, because corporations have actually had very good, much better balance sheet. Meanwhile, households are in much greater debt. So there's a major imbalance there. Corporate profits and this extra money has also gone to much higher CEO and executive compensation, a lot of share buybacks. So corporations have reduced their debt in that way. They've pumped up the price of the price of their shares. Speculative investments that have led to financial crisis, but not to increased real investments that would grow the economy or employ people. So this was also very well documented with U.S. Trump tax, the Trump tax cuts in the U.S. And they've contributed to increased inequality, especially at the top, and to increased housing price inflation. So without business investment, people are investing in real estate, which is driving prices higher and higher. It's interesting. I mean, it was just in the past. Katrina talked about the argument that corporate tax cuts would lead to increased investment. In fact, it's gone the opposite way. And it was just in the past couple of weeks that the conservative government in the UK basically admitted that these corporate tax cuts have not worked. That and they gave other tax cuts, but they're going to increase the corporate tax rate in the UK from 19% to 25%. So that's an admission of this massive, multi-$100 billion failure. I mean, when I've been on panels arguing this with people like Jack Mintz, it's that, oh no, we just need more tax cuts because, such and such a country has further cut taxes. And it's just been this race to the bottom in this way. So finally, I think we're seeing some changes there.
Katrina, I understand the Broadbent Institute did a survey on what Canadians thought of all these corporate tax cuts. It sounds like Canadians smelled a rat.
Yeah, and that's a good way of putting it. We've actually been surveying Canadians for quite a few years on this, starting in 2014, when I mentioned earlier, we surveyed Canadians on what they thought the distribution of wealth was. We surveyed them on what they thought it was. We presented to them what it actually was, which was about 15 points different to what they thought it was, and then asked for their reaction to that. And back then in 2014, people thought it was patently unfair. And 70% of them were starting to think about supporting things like taxing the rich more. Now, bring us up to 2019, when we did a survey around people's affordability concerns, because you have to remember, this is a time when we started hearing a lot about people not being able to afford their lives. And we found in that survey that people were starting to gain their support towards wanting to see those with wealth, both individuals and corporations, taxed more. And the more the concerned they were about their own affordability issues, about being able to afford their house, their life, their bills, their children, the more likely they were, in fact, to link one of the solutions being taxing the rich. In 2020, with the pandemic, we've seen that support grow extensively. And we've seen people now attach taxing wealth, taxing high income, taxing very profitable corporations with the things that they want to see in COVID recovery: better education, better healthcare. So now we're seeing rates of 75, 76, 78% of people in favor of these, and attaching it as something extremely important in a recovery plan, which brings us back to the federal budget. This is why it's so important for us to talk about tax measures in the federal budget, because a long-term recovery plan, the kinds we're dreaming about, cannot happen without that kind of tax plan.
Wasn't there a vote on the wealth tax about a month or two ago, Toby? And the Liberals voted against it.
Yeah, there was a proposal. I think it was a motion by the NDP in the fall on that as well. Yeah, absolutely. But you know what? I mean, we're, as Katrina said, we're really hoping to see something in it. We were glad to see the throne speech. The Liberals, even though it wasn't in their election campaign, they said that they would look at ways of taxing extreme wealth. So public pressure has really had an influence. And as Katrina said, that the support for something like a wealth tax is it just keeps on growing. It's close to 80%. I mean, a majority of conservatives, this is an anti-tax party, even supports it. A majority in all age groups and basically across the country. This pandemic has really increased awareness of the increased wealth of billionaires and how so many are struggling. A study that we published last year showed that our top billionaires had increased their wealth by about 50 billion in the first months of the pandemic, by about 28%. And also larger businesses are making record profits. So there's interest in things like an excess profits tax. And there's also, the pandemic has led to increased corporate concentration, as big corps like Amazon, Walmart, Google, and Facebook have done very well, while Main Street businesses are struggling. So there's a close connection that I think people don't often necessarily appreciate between corporate wealth, corporate concentration, and individual inequality. Much of the billionaire wealth comes from business and corporate ownership. So these things are closely connected as well.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, even last week, we saw the Conservative leader, Aaron O'Toole, at least in a letter to his constituents, to Conservative Party folks, a letter saying that the wealthy need to pay their fair share. Now, he hasn't added anything to that, but it's interesting to me that he's feeling the pressure to say something. So all three major parties now are saying something. There is one major party, of course, the NDP, who's provided significant concrete proposals around an excess profit tax, around closing certain loopholes, and around a wealth tax. So I think we're looking forward to the conversation that we have this budget process, and where we can take it from there. And really, I encourage everyone to join in that conversation. I think that this is a moment where we can change the conversation on taxes for the first time in 40 years to one that talks about taxes being what we all put in together in order to buy what we want together in our society. It is a key foundation of a democracy to have a healthy and progressive tax system. And that's what we need here in Canada.
Well, I hate to be a spoilsport, but I'd like to look at a few more of the really unfair aspects of our tax system. Katrina, the Broadbent Institute has talked about the filthy five.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just mention, for example, capital gains tax? How does that work and why is it unfair?
Well, yeah, capital gains is a classic loophole that is grossly unfair. Basically, it comes down to this. If you make your income by buying and selling stocks, if you make your income by buying and selling real estate, then your income is deemed capital gains and taxed at half the rate of a person who makes their income, being the cashier at our local grocery store. That's how this works. And it is so egregious that I think as soon as people hear about it, they realize in that moment that the tax system in many ways isn't built for the average person and that somehow it's been gamed. And I think when people hear about things like the capital gains loophole, that's when people feel like the government isn't building the system for them. And they feel like someone's gotten in there and messed around with the tools. This is clearly one of the tax loopholes that needs to close. And if we closed that capital gains loophole being used in that way, we would see about 16 billion more in government revenue that could go to things like healthcare, like education. So that's one example. That's one very egregious example, but there's a set of others that work in that same way. Stock option loopholes had that same 50% cut on the taxes because you make your money in a different way than the average wage earner. And that's just not fair.
So much for the old saying, a buck is a buck. Toby, if that's not bad enough, then there are the tax havens. Could you tell us a bit about how much money is going offshore and being hidden and kept from our society, basically?
Well, there's hundreds of billions of Canadian dollars that have gone offshore, and there's trillions globally. In terms of how big a problem it is and how much revenue is lost, we don't actually know, but because a lot of that is hidden. So we estimate the Canadian governments lose over 10 billion annually just to international corporate tax dodging by corporations, and billions more due to use of tax havens by wealthy individuals. So this is a conservative estimate. The Parliamentary Budget Officer last year estimated it could be as high as 25 billion. The IMF, International Monetary Fund, was it Peter Tosh or Bob Marley who sang about that? I mean, not a radical organization. They estimated that these losses were about 1% of GDP for OECD countries, which would mean about 20 billion for Canada. So, but the truth is we don't know, and that's because we don't have nearly as much transparency as we should. We don't know where multinational corporations make their profits or where they pay their taxes. They aren't required to publicly report on this. So this needs to change. We need to have country by country, public country by country reporting by multinationals, and the federal government should also report on what Canadian corporations above a certain size pay in profits and taxes, as Australia does. But we do know it's a big problem. Just recently, the CRA took uranium producer Cameco to court over $2 billion in taxes that the CRA said that they owed because Cameco had set up a subsidiary in Switzerland where they employed one person. They shifted all their profits there. So unfortunately, this case was just recently dismissed by the Supreme Court of Canada, which means that Canada really needs to change its laws and make sure that these larger corporations pay their fair share of taxes. And Canada itself is somewhat of a tax haven, especially for resource and mining companies. A lot of people don't know this. About 50% of publicly listed mining corporations worldwide have their headquarters in Canada. And that's partly because we have weak corporate transparency rules that attract these mining companies. And we're also weak at prosecuting corporate crime. So we need to do a lot more to deal with this, both in Canada and internationally in this way.
Somehow I keep getting unmuted. Katrina, as you mentioned, I think Canadians have a much better image of this country than really exists. But one of you mentioned big tech, foreign tech companies getting away without paying. Katrina, could you tell us about that? Because they've been pretty profitable over the last year.
Yeah, I mean, this is a conversation in Canada. This is a conversation globally, actually, that's taking place at the EU. It's taking place, right across countries. Basically, their digital commerce pays virtually little to no tax in all of these countries, including ourselves. So, for example, Netflix last year, as everyone was sitting home, locked down in the pandemic, saw a profit margin of 27% and paid virtually no Canadian tax on that. Now, one of the major issues that comes up with this, of course, is the idea of having a level playing field between various producers on the market. So our mom and pop shops, our retail stores, they all need to pay GST and HST, and they're starting to compete with the Amazons of the world, the Netflixes of the world, all of these digital corporate giants out there who are now selling products who don't have to pay any of that. So there's just a straight level of fairness there that has to be kept in mind in our tax system. There is conversation now about applying a sales tax, a digital sales tax, and some estimates, maybe Toby, you can speak more specifically about this. My understanding, some estimates have us that if we applied a digital sales tax, we'd be raising about 3 million to 4 million over about a 5-year period of time. People have also talked about taxing their corporate activity inside a country, which I don't have specific estimates around. Ultimately, though, this is something that Canada needs to act on. We've had some promises from the current government that they are going to move on this, and we also need to act on with our global partners.
Toby, do you want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, big tech companies have been easily able to avoid their taxes for a number of reasons. And they've been able to establish their intellectual property in different jurisdictions. And a lot of them were actually structured more recently to avoid taxes. So for example, Uber, it was set up to avoid taxes on a whole lot of different levels. From where people make the payments, I think they go through Netherlands or something like that. And but then at the same time that this whole digital economy, I mean, the big tech has been let off the hook in a whole lot of different ways in terms of sales taxes as well. But also the digital economy can't be ring fenced, as the OECD has said. It affects all parts of the economy. I mean, Uber is a taxi company, but it says it's a tech company. So there are these pretty intense discussions at the OECD about tax reform. The international corporate tax system operates on about a century-old system that's wildly out of date, and people agree it needs reform, but there's a lot of money at stake there, and the corporate lobbyists are very influential. So we need to make reforms so that corporations are taxed where the value is created, not on where they can fabricate or shift their profits. Canada has been very slow to deal with this, partly because they're very highly politically influential. Google and Facebook have caused incredible damage to media and news industries by sucking up a majority of advertising dollars. We've been fighting the federal government for this to level the digital playing field for years, and it's been very frustrating. But we're hoping, as Katrina said, to finally get a bit of progress this year. In this area. In terms of the OEC discussions, we've been very engaged with that. And there may be some incremental change. We need to push for greater change, though, some fundamental reforms. And tax these corporations the same way that we deal with it in Canada. It's not that complicated. We allocate profit between different provinces according to a formula in Canada. And this is exactly the type of thing that we should have internationally as well.
Toby, you've got your fair tax policy. Could you just tell us what else is in there that we haven't covered, just briefly?
Yeah, you mean our fair tax recovery plan that we put out?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, we put out something just last month showing that the federal government could generate an additional 75 billion annually and reduce inequalities by making our tax system fair. Katrina mentioned the tax loopholes. We've talked a bit about wealth taxes. So we estimate that you could, and this is using some pretty conservative estimates, that the federal government could generate about 30 billion by making our tax system more progressive with an annual wealth tax, by restoring corporate tax rates, not restoring them just to what they were a number of years ago, a surtax on top incomes and a pandemic super profits tax. We could generate about a 30 billion from closing tax loopholes, like the capital gains one that Katrina mentioned. Introducing a financial activities tax on banks in the financial sector. This is a bit of an alternative to the financial transactions tax on the profits and compensation in the financial sector, which even the IMF has proposed. Over 10 billion from tackling tax havens, and about 3 billion from, it could be more than this, from strengthening the carbon tax framework so that large polluters pay their fair share, and ending fossil fuel subsidies, and introducing a carbon border tax. So these are a number of measures that could generate about 75 billion. That's a substantial amount that could be used to pay for the costs of the pandemic, but also to build back better, invest in a lower carbon future, and to expand our social protections and invest in a whole lot of public services.
I hope people can't hear there's some construction in the apartment next to me. So that's why I think Ken keeps muting me.
Yeah, I've been muting you.
Yeah, I mean, I can hear the banging too. I told them to be quiet between 1 and 2, but how can I control that? Katrina, the Broadbent Institute is really working on tax issues. But can you tell us, we call ourselves Time4Action because we like to look at what people, viewers, and generally Canadians can do to fix up all these awful situations we find ourselves in. Is there anything you could suggest to our viewers that they could do about this?
Yes, absolutely. And I know Toby has suggestions too. Toby's organization, the Canadians for Tax Fairness and Broadbent Institute, are actually partnered with 6 other organizations: Acorn, Lead Now, Greenpeace, United Steelworkers, Oxfam, Quebec. I know I'm missing a couple more. And we've put together a campaign called Let's Tax the Rich.ca. So go to that campaign, let's tax the rich.ca. Join the campaign if you're an individual. If you are an organization and you want to sign on to a letter of support for the campaign, contact us and let us know. Right now, what we're trying to do is build a movement in Canada. We know that Canadians support taxing the rich. What we want to do is take that support and turn it into action and build a movement towards the federal budget and towards recovery overall. You know, how are you going to pay for this recovery in a fair way for Canada? Well, it's through these sorts of measures. On that website, of course, there's individual actions. Canadians for Tax Fairness have a great petition going right now to Chrystia Freeland. Our partners, Acorn Canada, have a campaign specifically about closing a tax loophole for real estate income trusts that they want to see closed because so many of their large landlords who aren't investing in affordable housing are actually hoarding their profit in those income trusts. And they want to see that tax loophole closed, and instead they want to see that money invested in affordable housing where they need it. So there's a number of places that we can go to take action, but also to join and become part of this movement. And so you can find out about actions that will be upcoming. There's a lot that we're going to be doing around the federal budget and after. We have actions coming down the pipe. And so the only way to stay informed is to join this campaign.
Toby, would you like to add to that? I'm sure you have lots to say.
Well, Katrina said it very well, and Katrina's been terrific at helping to build a broader coalition on these things from various groups, as she said, and I think Ken put it up. If you go to our website, we've got e-actions there, and at the Tax the Rich, the Broadbent campaign page. So we've got e-actions where you can send a letter to the finance minister, your local MP. You also sign up for our monthly newsletter to stay in touch and stay informed. write to your MP, your paper, send out tweets, follow us on Facebook, inform yourself, and vote for those supporting tax fairness. So we're a very small organization with very limited budget, but our strength on these issues is in our supporters and in engaged citizens. So it's time for change, and people need to make change if we're ever going to achieve the collective change that we need. People need to be active. And you know what? I know people can get cynical, but we actually do if enough people are engaged and make their voices heard, we actually can get movement. And we're in a minority government situation right now, so it is a great opportunity to achieve change now, particularly at the federal level.
It's actually very exciting right now. I mean, Toby and I have been around for a while around this issue of taxes. And I think we have spent probably most of our career feeling like taxes were a four-letter word for progressives. And largely, largely the wheelhouse of conservatives who were successfully arguing for tax cuts. And I think that that's really turned now. For activists watching this, this is our opportunity to take hold of the conversation about taxes and make it a conversation that's about progressive taxation and taxation to pay for the kind of society and the kind of Canada we want. And we haven't seen an opportunity like this in 40 years, so we better jump on it.
Thank you both. For my part, I'm so impressed with your knowledge and your organization. So I'll hand it over to Ken and see if he has some questions. And I'll mute myself.
Thanks, Kathleen. Yes, I'm very impressed with both of you, Toby and Katrina, on how articulate and compelling you are on your push for more tax. What I'm wondering, the first question I'd like to ask is, what would the Liberals say to what you're saying right now? Toby, do you want to handle that first?
Well, we'll be glad to see that there's been some movement. I mean, in the throne speech and in the fall economic statement. I mean, my concern is that there may be that they may say that they're going to do something, but only go partially that way. I mean, that the stock option, closing stock option deduction loophole was an example of that. They proposed changes in the 2019 budget, which wouldn't have done a ton on this, but would appear to do that. So really need to hold them and push for the substantial changes that we need. And you know what? Now with Biden there, I mean, yes, he wasn't as progressive as Warren and Sanders, but he's going to make some changes. So the whole excuse about the United States or other countries and the competitiveness thing don't hold up. So it really depends on the public pressure. As I said, we're in a politically advantageous stage right now with a minority government.
How much impact, Toby, do you think that the Biden administration will have on Liberal tax policy?
I don't know. It's certainly there. Katrina might have some ideas of that too. Yeah. We'll see. I mean, it depends on how much Biden can achieve himself as well on this.
I mean, I think it's a very fair point of discussion. We certainly know Trump tax policies had a significant impact on the Liberal government. There was, a good 8 months when Trump did his significant tax cuts in 2016, where every newspaper in the country was asking the Liberals whether or not they were going to follow suit. So I hope that we see the same reaction from the newspapers around whether or not Trudeau is going to follow suit on Biden's increases to the upper income tax brackets and the corporate taxes, as well as closing a number of loopholes, which I think is going to net them about $3 trillion or more over 10 years. So it's significant. These aren't incremental changes. These are significant changes that Biden is making. We did hear over the last 4 years that the reason why we couldn't move on taxes was because we had such an unpredictable economic giant next to us. That was often a story that was sort of told around why these changes need to be incremental instead of transformational. And I think now, if anything, the Liberals have lost their excuse for not moving forward with transformational change to our tax system to make it a fair and more progressive tax system.
Thank you. One of the questions that someone came in with, and I don't want to leave it, is why is Netflix, people can't believe it quite when you say Netflix and Amazon don't pay any taxes, but I've read about it myself. Do you want to just explain that a bit, Katrina, to us?
I'm going to actually hand it over to Toby, who's the economist and very much better at giving the mechanisms of how they get out of that one.
Yeah. So I mean, Netflix doesn't pay any corporate tax in Canada, or we don't think it does, and we don't think that Amazon does either, but we don't know. They are able to avoid their taxes by establishing subsidiaries in different jurisdictions and avoiding. There's a number of different techniques that they'll use to do that, but they have the effect of shifting their profits to a lower tax jurisdiction, but also making use of a number of different tax dodges. There are some pretty common ones. One is intellectual property. Another one might be interest deductibility, lending money actually between different subsidiaries and charging high interest rates and then using that. So these are fairly common ones. So those are a number of things. But first of all, we need to get an idea on how much tax they actually do pay in different jurisdictions. And so that's why we need increased transparency and accountability in this way. Now I did notice, maybe you're going to ask this, sorry I jump on this, but I noticed in the chat that people were saying, well, the argument has been made that the rich will just avoid it, or corporations would just avoid it in different ways, paying their taxes, and that these things won't work. Well, this is all a matter of political will. If governments actually tighten down on these ways of avoiding taxes and increase enforcement in different ways, then we'll tighten up the tax system in that way. Right now we have a tax system with a whole lot of loopholes, and frankly, governments have been more lenient towards the higher incomes and the wealthy corporations because they've got a lot of political influence. They hire the right accountants and things like that, and we don't prosecute them. So it's a matter of political will on this as well, how much they'll take advantage of avoidance. Just quickly,
for Netflix, how would you counter the fact they say, oh, we don't make our profits here, or whatever reasons they use for not paying tax in Canada? What do you see?
Well, there's a whole lot, just on Netflix itself. When people talk about Netflix tax, they're talking about a few different things, but people don't pay sales tax for Netflix subscriptions, but they do for a Crave subscription. And so that is something
because Crave is Canadian, is that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's something anachronistic in our tax system, that we haven't taxed digital imports. Now the Liberals have committed to saying that they're going to do that, but that's going to fall on consumers. There's a profit that the companies make that is located elsewhere. As I mentioned before, I think we should fundamentally reform our international corporate tax system so that the profit is allocated to jurisdictions where the value is added, and that's through sales, that's through employment. It's a system that we use here in Canada. The United States uses it as well, and it should be used internationally as well. And tax justice groups around the world have advocated for this. And there may be some incremental but small changes in the package that the OECD is supposed to agree to this coming year, but they're not going far enough. We should be doing more, and there's more that Canada can do on its own on this as well.
Thank you. Katrina, your read on the Liberals and whether they're going to act or how much they'll act?
I think we will see incremental change. I think they'll probably finally implement the partial closure of the stock options, the poll that they've said that they'll do. I think they will start to move on some sort of sales tax for these digital giants. But I think that if we want them to make larger, more substantial changes, like a wealth tax, like an excess profit tax, and multiple countries are talking about this right now and implementing these sorts of changes, and really starting to ratchet down some of those tax loopholes, including tax avoidance. We need a lot more activism around it. We need a lot more of Canadians calling on their politicians and on their representatives to support this, to demonstrate support explicitly, and letting them know that, you know, their vote on this requires this kind of support. So I think a lot more activism needs to happen before we're really going to see the Liberals take really substantive action.
I think, unfortunately, it sounds very much like Liberal policy, whether you're talking Indigenous affairs, whether you're talking climate, the climate crisis, whatever it is that the Liberals are dealing with, there always needs to be way more push, because they talk about doing a lot, but as you know, they don't always do a lot, unfortunately.
Well, they've, you know, this is a time, I think, for transformation. I think that's what we're recognizing, is that we can't do incremental change anymore at this point. There are too many crises facing us as a society. There are too many problems that have been exposed by the pandemic that were actually longstanding. And we're, as I said, we're facing a future that will have more crises coming at us. And so we need transformational change now, in our tax system and in the way that we operate as a society, in the way that we ensure we have an inclusive, fair society, the way that we approach our, you know, our place on this planet. We need that kind of transformational change. And I think that's the call right now to those who are making decisions for us at our various governments, is show us your plan to transform our society into one that can be resilient, adaptable, and inclusive in the face of the coming crisis.
Thank you. There's no doubt the COVID-19 and how they've been able to open up the coffers just wide open and spend whatever they needed to really calls nonsense on all the austerity from before that.
Yeah.
When there's, if it's as you folks in both your groups say, it's a choice. What we do in terms of taxes is a choice. It's not about economics or anything else.
Yeah,
So,
that's what I was going to say. I mean, I know people are exhausted by the pandemic and, you know, wanting to get back to some level of normalcy as well. But the pandemic, so for so long we've had the excuse, oh, this is going to cost too much. It's too complicated. It'll take years to do and everything else. But one thing that we learned in the past year is that when there's a crisis and government wants to act, it can act. And, you know, I have to hand, you know, kudos to this government. We addressed some of those problems. We had a tattered social safety net that to some extent, to a certain extent, they've addressed with the SIR program. I mean, government acted very quickly. Yes, you know, it didn't act perfectly, but it put in place the measures that were really, you know, could be transformative in different ways and address a pandemic. So we can do that. We can do that with inequality. We can do it with climate change. We can do it with these other challenges that face us. And there's no excuse that we can't. And if the excuse is, oh, the deficit is too high and we can't afford it, we've shown that the money is there in revenue as well, and in different sources of progressive taxes, so we can address these things.
Christine and Toby, I think I'm going to organize a little dinner for you two with Chrystia Freeland perhaps this weekend. I think that would be helpful. Thank you. I'd like to turn it over to Rolly to ask some other questions, maybe from the audience. Rolly, do you want to take over there?
Sure. Thank you, Ken. And one to follow up on one of the questions, one of the comments you made a while ago about the Liberal government, you know, saying a lot of the right things, but not necessarily acting. This was the very first question that appeared, and it said, shouldn't we put a push on Mark Carney for PM? Now, I don't expect anybody to answer that, but I thought it was a nice question, so I'll skip over it and get to something a little bit more substantial. Okay, what are the panelists' view on the capital gains exemption on the sale of principal residences? I thought that was interesting. So either one of you or both?
Yes. Toby, do you want to go first? Or do you want me to go first? Either way.
Yeah, you can go first. Eh? Yeah.
It's really interesting because the Globe and Mail actually just wrote an editorial on this this weekend, and perhaps the attendee who's posed the question saw that editorial where the Globe and Mail, in fact, was arguing seemingly in favor of a tax, a capital gains tax on the sale of principal residence, which aren't taxed right now. It receives an exemption. You know, my personal view is I think that it's worth considering after we close the rest of the tax loophole on all of the financial gains that are received via investment properties, via stocks, dividends, by all these other ways that capital gains are gained that are now being taxed only half the rate. I think that that's where we go first, is to close down that part of the loophole. And then we can look at, you know, taxing capital gains on principal residence, particularly those principal residents that happen to be worth $4, $5, $6 million, because that's included in that. And I think that when you're selling your house for $4 or $5 or $6 million, that perhaps you should be taxed on that profit.
Yeah. I mean, if I can just add to that, I mean, maybe we could have a cap on the capital gains through personal residences. But Katrina pointed out the bit of the hypocrisy there, right? You know, coming from the Globe and Mail, the people who own the Globe and Mail are the wealthiest family in Canada. They've got a lot of corporate wealth there. How about some capital gains on that? Also, houses are the main source of asset or wealth that middle class or ordinary Canadians have. They pay property taxes at about 1%. That's a wealth tax, right? So we have a wealth tax on our properties, on the main asset that ordinary Canadians have, but we don't have a wealth tax on other sources of wealth that much higher income people tend to have. So yeah, I mean, I think people are concerned about it partly because it's helped to fuel asset housing lack of affordability. So, and then also deal with the general capital gains, the reduced rate of tax on capital gains for even secondary residences. I agree with Katrina. Let's deal with some of these other issues first instead of going there.
Thank you for the answers. I think we have time for one more question for sure. This one is from Lois Adams, and she's asking, is the wealth tax different than increasing the top income tax level?
Yeah, if I can ask that, yeah, a wealth tax is on assets and the wealth, the accumulated wealth that people have. Increasing the top income tax rate is something different. That's on the income that people have, the flow of income as opposed to the stock. Now, a lot of people have increased their wealth without necessarily increasing their income in that way. So yes, it is a different. It's a different thing.
Okay, thank you for that. Ken, did you want to allow more questions? I'm not sure where we are for time here.
Yeah, I think Katrina has to leave and Toby can stay for a little longer. So
I'm good for about another 10 minutes.
Oh, great.
I cleared my
Okay.
schedule.
Okay, I'll ask another question. I'm working on my income tax right now. Do you have any tips for me? Never mind. No, that's not. You don't have to answer that. Okay. Let me see. We've already covered Amazon and Netflix. There's a lot of interest about why they don't pay taxes. I'm not sure if we actually covered that. Did you want to take another stab at that? Like, why is it that they don't pay taxes? Is it CRTC exemptions, or I think people need to understand that, even though we've talked about it quite a bit already.
Yeah, I mean, Amazon has paid a bit in taxes, and at least according to their corporate reports in the U.S., but we don't know where they're paying taxes, and the tax rates that the large big tech companies pay, including Google and Facebook and Amazon, that paid much lower rates of tax. And what they do is they might establish, and Starbucks does this too, they'll put their intellectual property. So this is a common tax thing. And maybe for those who are watching who've got their own large corporations, they can use this as a tax tip.
Thank you.
So you establish your intellectual property. You say, my Starbucks or my Nike swoosh, that's another one. They'll put that basically in a tax haven, and they will pay billions of dollars for the right to use it's so-called intellectual property, and that will reduce from other countries like Canada or elsewhere. That will by increasing their expenses, they reduce their profit there. They shift their profit to those other jurisdictions. Big pharma companies do that too. Pfizer is which strongly advocated for the federal government to cut taxes in Canada. It's got very little investment in Canada. It's a major tax dodger as well. So that's one way of avoiding taxes. They'll also do it through some of the other things that giving stock options, and then also by paying higher amounts of interest to a subsidiary, a wholly owned subsidiary, basically a bank in another. They will lend themselves loans at high rates of interest. So if individuals could do all this on their own, we'd also pay much lower rates of tax ourselves, but we pay tax on our essentially on our taxable income. We don't deduct the food or the expenses, that other things that we pay. So those are some of the maneuvers that people use, that corporations use, and they'll have subsidiaries in multiple tax in different countries, sometimes the Caribbean, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Ireland. So it's this whole maze where that they exploit international corporate tax system to avoid taxes in different ways. It can be hard to figure out exactly how they do it because so it's a bit of an investigative journey to try and figure that out each time.
Toby, do you think Time4Action could trademark their intellectual property and drop my income taxes, man?
Exactly.
Well, that's about what it amounts to. If Nike thinks they can, trademark for billions of dollars, why not me?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
you do.
Yeah, there's the one of the first steps here, and these steps don't happen to have to happen consecutively. They can happen concurrently, but one of the first steps, it clearly is transparency. We need the government to require greater transparency on where these transactions are happening, where taxes are being paid, and how basically this massive shell game is going down. And there's actually been motions, on the floor of Parliament before asking for that transparency, and we still don't have it, as far as I understand. Toby, maybe have more detail about that. But at the same time, there's some things that we can do right away, like ensure that we aren't giving government subsidies to tax dodgers. For example, we can start to ratchet down the way that Canada allows for tax avoidance that Toby mentioned before amongst our mining companies. There's a number of things that the Canadian government can do right now as it seeks to, and hopefully becomes a leader in global action on this, because it does require us to act internationally through international bodies in order to shut down some of this global tax avoidance that we're seeing right across the board.
But there are also a lot of things that we can do now. I mean, the Liberals in their last election campaign proposed limiting interest deductibility, and that would generate billions of dollars. The amounts that corporations could deduct in interest from their profit. This is something that the OECD has said countries around the world should do, and Canada's been slow in doing this. Corporations and corporate lobby groups have pushed for patent, what they call patent boxes, and a whole lot of different schemes to avoid corporate taxes, and we need to resist that and limit the amount that and make sure that corporations are taxed where the value is created. There was a private members bill by a former MP, Murray Rankin, on economic substance, fairly straightforward one, which would increase the tools that the federal government could have to go after this type of tax dodging. So there's a lot that we can do in Canada as well. Individually, of course, better to have some international progress on top in this, but without that, there's a ton that we can do here in Canada as well. Also, in terms of our tax treaties with that. We've got a whole lot of tax treaties with tax havens. We shouldn't have that.
Just one quick last question, I think a couple of minutes maybe. I found this one interesting myself. How do you see the wealth tax would be charged? How would that work? Just an example, a very quick example.
For sure. I mean, I can take that up. I mean, a lot, as I mentioned, a ton of the wealth, and actually a study just came out that was reported on Bloomberg recently. So much of that wealth in the for the very tippy top, as Elizabeth Warren said, for those with wealth of over 10 or 20 million, is in the corporate shares, and that's easy to track. I mean, you can track that minute to minute, so it's not a valuation issue, and we know how much it is. I mean, Forbes reports on it the whole time. Now, there are other elements of wealth that can be valued. We value houses, you know, on an annual basis, so those things can be quite easily valued. I mean, of course, there will be some form of tax avoidance. There is in every area, but that's no reason to not do it. And in fact, the administration costs and the enforcement costs for something like an annual wealth tax probably lower than a whole lot of other forms of taxation, like the GST.
Yeah, it's actually it's fairly simple, it would seem, and more studies are coming out showing that the tax avoidance is lower than previously thought on the idea of taxing wealth through a wealth tax. This is really talking about the minimal amount. You know, this is like 1% on wealth over 20 million. So the wealth, this is an important distinction for folks. The wealth below 20 million wouldn't receive a wealth tax. It would only be the wealth over that 20 million. I'm just taking one proposal that's been put out. Some proposals have been talked about that would have a graduated wealth tax. So you would have 1% on 20 million, 2% on 40 million, so forth and so forth. We go further and further with that. But again, you know, like we deal with graduated income taxes, that's how it would work on wealth. This is really a person's net wealth too. So we're calculating, of course, pulling out what someone would owe on mortgages or other rents that they have going on in their lives. And so it really, you know, to me, this is, you know, well stated as, you know, the tax on the itty bitty top, the tax on ultra wealth in our society, wealth where, you know, this type of tax, 1% tax on someone's wealth over 20 million will have virtually no impact in real terms on their lives in comparison to what it could do for someone who receives better education or better healthcare or better public services.
Thank you, Katrina. I feel a whole lot better if it's only over 20 million. So back to you, Ken.
You don't realize how wealthy Rolly is and his 14 properties he has and assets.
Yeah.
And his Netflix stock and his Amazon stock.
And you're paying your investment dealer like 2% per year anyhow, right? So just subtract it from that. Right?
I had one last question I wanted to ask the two of you. Given that Time for Action is, we're really focused on climate, I'd like some comment. I noticed it's in, Toby, it's in your tax fairness report this month or from last month about carbon tax and subsidies related to that.
Sure. I mean, there's been a lot of controversy about carbon tax. In fact, I think the Supreme Court decision on this is coming out this week or something on this, right? I'm in favor of a carbon tax. We should tax pollution and things like that, but it's not the only. We need. I don't believe we should just rely on a carbon tax. We absolutely can't. We need to use all the tools in our toolbox on this, but we should have a progressive carbon tax. Parts of what the Liberals brought in were progressive, but at the same time, they kind of left off the hook the largest emitters, the largest polluters, through a cap and trade system. I think that we should have that we should strengthen the carbon tax framework so that the large polluters pay their fair share, and that we have what they call carbon tax adjustments, border adjustments. So we have a tax on imports from countries that don't have adequate carbon tax price in place, and then maybe some rebates on the flip side there, so to deal with competitiveness side. So that's one thing, and then also dealing with fossil fuel subsidies, which we'll continue to have. But that's just one tool in the toolbox, and we need to have regulation, we need to have education, we need to have a whole lot of other things, urban design, and a whole lot of other things to deal with the climate crisis. Absolutely. And make sure that the revenues go back to making sure that this is not a regressive measure. That it's not a regressive tax because left on its own, a carbon tax can be quite regressive. So you need to recycle that revenue both into complementary environmental measures, but also into making sure that lower income and middle income people aren't worse off from this, and that they have more money to invest into lower carbon measures and you know, whether it's vehicles or bicycles or whatever.
Katrina?
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, Katrina?
Yeah, I agree with everything Toby said. I've always been a little concerned about the carbon tax being the magic bullet to reducing our carbon in our society, because it's not. It is a substantial element in a package of tools, but it needs to be paired with a strong regulatory framework that takes us to a net carbon zero future sooner than later. And it also needs to be paired with a robust investment plan that the government has to ensure that it is leading the growth of our clean economy, and doing so in ways that benefit our society best. So making sure that there's decent jobs in that, making sure that it is an economy that benefits communities where the wealth that's generated stays in those communities instead of being siphoned off into as we talked about, corporate profit hoarding that then goes offshore. We really need a much more robust, comprehensive plan than just a carbon tax in order for a carbon tax to actually be most productive.
Great. I think we should leave it there. I think those last two answers are a great ending. I texted Chrystia Freeland while we were talking, and I've arranged dinner for the two of you. She said Saturday night would work in Ottawa. And
perfect.
both here, so good luck.
Socially distanced, of course.
Of course. Kathleen, do you want to say any last word? You're still muted, Kathleen.
Can you unmute me?
You're unmuted.
Oh, before Katrina has to rush away, I want to thank you both again. It's been really enlightening and frightening. One thing I remember, I found this very revealing. Harper cut the investigative unit for the tax avoidance investigative unit when he was in power. So guess whose side he was on, if we ever had any doubts. But I think the Liberals have reinstated some of it. I wanted to tell about next week. Because of the budget, we're going to have Elizabeth May, who needs no introduction, and senior economist Mark Lee, who's with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And we'll be looking at what they think will be happening on April 19th. And if today wasn't enough to whet your appetite on that subject, nothing will. So please join us next week. And again, thank you to our wonderful guests and to our viewers. And Ken, any last words about lunches or anything else?
No, nothing. Let's see. Nothing else there, but just extraordinary. Thank you both, Katrina and Toby, so much. It's just always a pleasure to talk to people with a deep knowledge on these subjects, and tax obviously is an incredibly important one. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. And thank you very, very much for putting on these series. They've been great.
Oh, you're welcome.
We love it.
And thank you for all the people who've joined us today and other days. It's what makes it happen. Okay, bye for